The 37th floor of the Blackwood Tower in Manhattan was supposed to be empty at 2 in the morning. Marie Santos, night shift cleaning lady, was mopping the executive hallway when she heard the crash. She found him in the corner office, collapsed on the Italian marble floor. A man in a white shirt with intricate tattoos crawling up his neck, his face turning blue, his chest not moving. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that he was Dominic Blackwood, the most feared man in New York's underworld, the head of an empire built on shadows and secrets. All she knew was that he was dying, and she was the only one who could save him. She dropped to her knees, tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and pressed her lips to his, breathing life into a man who had taken so many lives himself. When his eyes finally opened, dark and dangerous and filled with something she couldn't name, Marie realized that she had just changed both their destinies forever, because Dominic Blackwood never forgot a debt, and he never let go of what was his. If you're ready for this story, type in the comments where you're watching from. Marie Santos had been invisible her entire life, and she had learned to prefer it that way. Growing up in the Bronx as the daughter of Dominican immigrants, she had understood early that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who were seen and those who did the seeing. She belonged firmly to the second category, the ones who existed in the margins, who moved through spaces without leaving traces, who witnessed everything and were witnessed by no one. She was 32 years old, and she'd been cleaning office buildings for the past 14 years, ever since she dropped out of high school to help support her family after her father's accident at the construction site. Her mother had worked herself into an early grave trying to make ends meet, and Marie had promised at her funeral that she would do whatever it took to give her younger brother a better life. Carlos was in his third year at Columbia now, studying pre-med, and every time Marie looked at the tuition bills, she reminded herself why she worked double shifts and never complained. The cleaning job at Blackwood Tower was her best position yet. The pay was surprisingly good, the work was straightforward, and she rarely had to interact with the actual employees of whatever mysterious corporation occupied the upper floors. She knew there was something unusual about this building. The security was excessive, with armed guards at every entrance and cameras that tracked her every movement. The executives who worked late always seemed to fall silent when she entered a room, waiting for her to finish before resuming their conversations. And there were things she had seen that she knew better than to mention. Blood on a bathroom floor that she mopped without asking questions. Men with injuries that looked nothing like paper cuts or coffee burns. Files left open on desks that contained names and numbers that made no sense, but felt dangerous just to look at. Marie had survived the Bronx. She knew how to mind her own business. That Tuesday night in November, she had been assigned to the executive floor for the first time. It was supposed to be a simple job, just vacuuming and dusting the offices, while the building's regular night cleaner was on maternity leave. The supervisor had given her very specific instructions. Don't touch anything on the desks. Don't open any drawers. Don't look at any screens. Clean quickly and thoroughly and leave no trace that you were ever there. Marie had nodded and taken the service elevator to the 37th floor, her cart of cleaning supplies squeaking slightly on the polished floors. The hallway was silent, except for the hum of the climate control system, and the offices were dark behind their glass walls. She started at the far end, working her way methodically toward the corner suite that dominated the entire east side of the building. She was almost finished when she heard the crash. It came from the corner office, a heavy thud followed by the sound of something shattering. Marie's first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever happened in these offices was none of her business. But then she heard another sound, a strangled gasp that could only be someone in distress, and her feet were moving before her brain could catch up. The corner office door was ajar. Marie pushed it open and saw him. He was lying on the floor between the desk and the window, a man in his early 40s with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a white dress shirt that was now soaked with sweat. His face was grey, his lips were turning blue, and his eyes were open but unseeing, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone who was already halfway gone. Marie didn't hesitate. She had taken a CPR course years ago, when Carlos had been hospitalized with an asthma attack, and she had sworn that she would never again feel helpless in a medical emergency. The training came back to her automatically, the positioning, the compressions, the breaths. She dropped to her knees beside the stranger, tilted his head back to open his airway, pinched his nose shut, and covered his mouth with hers. She breathed into him once, twice, 3 times, watching his chest rise and fall. Then she started compressions, pressing down hard on his sternum, counting under her breath, trying not to think about the tattoos that covered his neck, or the scars she could see on his hands, or the gun she had just noticed in the holster under his jacket. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of desperate effort, and finally, he coughed and gasped and opened his eyes. They were dark brown, almost black, and when they focused on her face, Marie felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more dangerous, more possessive, as if he was cataloguing every detail of her face and storing it away for future reference. He said one word, his voice rough and broken from oxygen deprivation. He asked who she was. Marie told him her name before she could think better of it. Then she pulled out her phone to call 911, but his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with a strength that seemed impossible for a man who had just been technically dead. He told her no hospitals, no police, and then his eyes rolled back, and he lost consciousness again. But this time his chest was moving steadily, and his color was returning, and Marie knew that whatever had happened to him, the worst was over. She sat there on the floor beside him for what felt like hours, watching him breathe, waiting for someone to come and explain what she should do next. When the elevator doors finally opened and a group of men in dark suits rushed into the office, Marie realized that her simple life as an invisible cleaning lady had just become very, very complicated. Dominic Blackwood had been born into violence and had made it his art form. His father had been a mid-level enforcer for the Moretti family, the kind of man who broke bones for a living and came home with blood on his hands and darkness in his eyes. His mother had died when he was 7, a casualty of a war between rival families that had never been officially declared. Dominic had grown up in the shadow of that loss, nursing a cold fury that he had learned to control, but never to extinguish. By the time he was 20, he had already made a name for himself as someone who could solve problems that others considered unsolvable. By 30, he had taken over his father's position and expanded it into something far more ambitious. By 40, he had built an empire that extended from the docks of New Jersey to the penthouses of Manhattan, from legitimate businesses that laundered money to illegitimate operations that generated it. He was not a good man. He had never pretended to be. The tattoos on his neck were not decorative. They were a record of his history, a map of the bodies he had left behind and the battles he had won. The scars on his hands told similar stories, of knife fights in back alleys and negotiations that had gone wrong, of moments when words had failed and violence had been the only language that mattered. But he was not unnecessarily cruel either. Dominic understood that power was not about destruction, it was about control. He ruled his organization with a combination of fear and loyalty, rewarding those who served him well and eliminating those who betrayed him with a ruthlessness that discouraged others from making the same mistake. His people respected him because he was fair. His enemies feared him because he was relentless. The heart attack had come from nowhere, a betrayal by his own body that he had never anticipated. He had always known he would die violently, a bullet or a blade, or an explosion that would end his reign in a manner befitting his lifestyle. He had not expected to collapse in his own office like a weak old man, his heart stuttering and stopping while he clawed at his chest and wondered if this was how it would end. And then there had been her, the cleaning lady with the brown eyes and the gentle hands, the woman who had breathed life back into his lungs and refused to let him die. He had seen her face hovering above his, felt her lips on his, and in that moment of transition between death and life, he had made a decision that would change everything. When he woke up in his private medical facility 3 days later, surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants and a team of doctors who had been brought in from different cities to ensure discretion, the first thing he asked about was the woman. His second in command, a man named Victor, who had served his family for 3 decades, provided the information without being asked. Marie Santos, 32 years old, no criminal record, no connections to any rival organizations, just a cleaning lady who had been in the wrong place at the right time and had made a choice that most people would never have made. Dominic listened to the report in silence, his face betraying nothing of what he was thinking. When Victor asked what he wanted to do about her, whether she should be eliminated to prevent her from talking, Dominic had felt a surge of something that might have been anger. Though he was not used to experiencing such emotions about strangers, he told Victor that no one was to touch her. He told him to have someone check on her, discreetly, to make sure she was all right and that she hadn't been traumatized by what had happened. And he told him to arrange a meeting, because Dominic Blackwood always paid his debts, and this was a debt he intended to pay in full. The doctors had warned him to take it easy, to avoid stress and exertion, to accept that his body was not as invincible as he had always believed. Dominic had listened politely and then ignored every word of their advice. He had an empire to run, enemies to outmaneuver, and now, apparently, a cleaning lady to find. He didn't understand why she was still on his mind. He had been saved before by doctors and surgeons and specialists who had patched him up after various attempts on his life. He had never felt this strange compulsion to seek them out, to look into their eyes and understand who they were. But something about Marie Santos was different. Something about the way she had looked at him, without fear, without recognition, without the calculation that he saw in everyone else's eyes. She had saved him because it was the right thing to do. Not because she wanted something from him, not because she knew who he was, not because she was playing some angle that he couldn't see. She had saved him simply because he was a human being who was dying, and she had the power to help. In Dominic's world, such selflessness was practically extinct, and that made it infinitely valuable. Marie had spent the days since that night in a state of anxious anticipation, waiting for something to happen but not knowing what. The men in dark suits had taken over the moment they arrived, moving her aside with a brusque efficiency that made it clear she was no longer needed. One of them had taken her phone and deleted her recent calls. Another had escorted her to a conference room and told her to wait, then left her there for hours until a lawyer had arrived with a stack of papers and a very large check. The non-disclosure agreement was 30 pages long, filled with legal jargon that Marie didn't fully understand. The check was for $50,000, more money than she made in 2 years of cleaning offices. The lawyer had explained that this was a gesture of gratitude for her discretion and that she would receive additional compensation if she continued to demonstrate that she could keep certain matters private. Marie had signed the papers and taken the check because she was not stupid and because Carlos needed that money for his tuition. But she had also lain awake every night since then, replaying the moment when those dark eyes had opened and looked at her, wondering who the man with the neck tattoos really was and why saving his life felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The answer came on a Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the incident. Marie was leaving her apartment building, heading to her shift at another office tower on the east side, when a black sedan pulled up beside her and a window rolled down. The man inside was not the one she had saved, but there was something familiar about him, a quiet authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed. He introduced himself as Victor and said that Mr. Blackwood would like to see her. It was phrased as a request, but Marie understood instinctively that refusing was not really an option. She got into the car and tried to control her racing heart as they drove through Manhattan toward an address she didn't recognize. The building they arrived at was nondescript from the outside, just another luxury apartment tower in a neighborhood full of them. But the inside told a different story. The lobby was staffed by men who were clearly not regular doormen, their postures too alert, their eyes too watchful. The elevator required a special key to access the penthouse floor, and when the doors opened, Marie found herself in a space that looked like it belonged in a magazine, all dark wood and leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He was waiting for her by the window, silhouetted against the skyline, and when he turned around, Marie felt that same strange jolt of recognition that she had experienced when his eyes first opened on that office floor. He looked better than he had that night. The color had returned to his face, and he was dressed impeccably in a dark suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. But the tattoos were still visible above his collar, and the scars on his hands were still there when he reached out to take hers, and Marie understood that this was not a man who hid who he was. He thanked her for saving his life, not with the casual gratitude of someone acknowledging a minor favor, but with a weight and sincerity that suggested he understood exactly what she had done and what it had cost her. He said that he had looked into her background and that he knew about her brother and her struggles and the reasons why she worked 3 jobs and never complained. Marie felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before. This man, this stranger, whose life she had saved, knew more about her than some of her closest friends. And instead of feeling violated by that knowledge, she felt oddly relieved, as if someone had finally seen her, really seen her, for the first time in her life. He offered her a position. Not cleaning, he said, but something more substantial. He had businesses that needed managing, properties that needed overseeing, tasks that required someone trustworthy and discreet. The salary he mentioned was obscene, enough to pay off Carlos's tuition in a single year and still have money left over. Marie knew she should say no. She knew that accepting this offer would mean stepping into a world that she had spent her entire life avoiding, a world of violence and secrets and moral compromises that she was not prepared to make. But she also knew that she was tired of being invisible, tired of working herself to exhaustion for wages that barely covered the bills, tired of watching other people live the lives she had always dreamed of while she mopped their floors and emptied their trash. She said yes, and when Dominic Blackwood smiled, a rare expression that transformed his severe features into something almost handsome, Marie knew that her life would never be the same. The transition from cleaning lady to whatever she was now happened gradually, like stepping into a pool 1 inch at a time. Dominic started by having her manage one of his legitimate businesses, a small chain of laundromats in Brooklyn that he used primarily for money laundering, but that also provided actual services to actual customers. Marie threw herself into the work with the same dedication she had brought to her cleaning jobs, learning the operations, improving the efficiency, treating the employees with a kindness that they were clearly not used to receiving from their employers. She learned the names of every worker, remembered their birthdays, asked about their families, small gestures that cost nothing but meant everything to people who were used to being treated as invisible as she had once been.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
Within 3 months, she had turned the laundromats from a minor money laundering operation into a genuine profit center. She had redesigned the layout for better customer flow, introduced a loyalty program that brought in repeat business, and negotiated better deals with suppliers that reduced operating costs by nearly 20%. Dominic was impressed, though he showed it only in small ways. A nod of approval here, a brief word of praise there. He assigned her more responsibilities, more properties, more access to the legitimate side of his empire. The illegitimate side, she understood, was off limits. Dominic never discussed his other business with her, never involved her in meetings that dealt with anything that might require her to compromise her principles. It was a boundary that he seemed to have established deliberately, a wall between the darkness he lived in and the light he wanted her to remain in. Marie was grateful for it, even as she grew more curious about the man behind the empire and the scars that told stories he never shared. They spent more time together as the months passed. Business dinners at restaurants where the waiters knew his name and the tables were always available. Late nights at his penthouse going over financial reports that somehow ended with them talking about their childhoods, their losses, their dreams. Dominic told her about his mother, about the way she used to sing to him in Italian when he was scared, about the emptiness that had never quite healed after she was gone. Marie told him about her father, about the way he used to dance with her mother in their tiny kitchen on Sunday mornings, about the guilt she still carried for not being there when he died, because she had been working a double shift that she couldn't afford to miss. They were from different worlds, bound by circumstances that should never have brought them together. But somehow, in those quiet moments between business and silence, they found something in each other that neither had known they were missing, a recognition, an understanding, a sense that they had both been waiting for someone who could see past the surface and find the person hiding underneath. The first time he kissed her, it was almost an accident. They were standing on his balcony, looking at the city lights, discussing something mundane about property taxes, and then suddenly his hand was on her face, and his lips were on hers, and Marie felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. It was different from the kiss that had saved his life. That had been desperate and functional, a medical procedure performed by a stranger. This was intentional and intimate, a choice made by two people who knew exactly what they were doing and what it would mean. Marie pulled back first, her heart racing, her mind screaming all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. She was his employee. He was a criminal. Their lives were too different, their futures too uncertain, their worlds too incompatible for anything between them to last. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had never expected to find there: vulnerability, hope, a longing that mirrored her own, as if he too had spent his life waiting for someone who could see past the surface and find the person underneath. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward and kissed him again, and this time neither of them pulled away. Their relationship remained a secret for almost a year, hidden from his lieutenants and her remaining friends, confined to stolen moments in private spaces where no one could see them together. Dominic insisted on the secrecy, not out of shame, but out of protection. In his world, love was a weakness that could be exploited, a pressure point that enemies would not hesitate to use. If anyone knew how much Marie meant to him, she would become a target. Marie understood the logic, but the secrecy wore on her. She wanted to be able to hold his hand in public, to introduce him to Carlos, to build a life that existed in daylight rather than only in shadows. She wanted to believe that they could have a future that didn't require them to hide who they were. The crisis came in the form of a rival organization, a group from Chicago that had been expanding into New York territory and had finally decided that Dominic Blackwood was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The first sign of trouble was a bombing at one of the laundromats, the very first property that Dominic had assigned to Marie. No one was killed, but the message was clear. The second sign was a car that followed Marie home from work one evening, the driver making no effort to conceal his surveillance. The third sign was a photograph that arrived at Dominic's penthouse, showing Marie leaving his building in the early morning hours, her face clearly visible in the dawn light. Dominic's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Marie had never seen him truly angry before, had only glimpsed the violence that lurked beneath his controlled exterior. But when he saw that photograph, something in him snapped. He made phone calls in rapid Italian, issued orders that sent his people scrambling, and within hours, the entire organization was on a war footing. He told Marie that she needed to leave the city, to go somewhere safe until the situation was resolved. He had a house in the Hamptons, he said, fully staffed and heavily guarded, where she could wait out the storm. She would have everything she needed, and he would come to her as soon as he could, as soon as he had dealt with the threat. Marie refused. She had spent her entire life running from danger, hiding from conflict, accepting the margins as her natural place in the world. She was tired of running. She was tired of hiding. And she was not going to let the first person who had ever truly seen her face a threat alone. The argument that followed was the worst they had ever had. Dominic raged about her stubbornness, about her inability to understand the stakes, about the danger she was putting herself in by refusing to leave. Marie shot back about his controlling nature, about his assumption that he knew what was best for her, about the fundamental inequality in a relationship where one person made all the decisions and the other was expected to comply. In the end, they reached a compromise. Marie would not leave the city, but she would move into the penthouse, where Dominic could ensure her safety personally. She would take a leave of absence from her work, staying out of public view until the threat was neutralized, and Dominic would include her in the plans, sharing information about the situation rather than keeping her in the dark. The weeks that followed were tense and terrifying. Marie learned more about Dominic's world than she had ever wanted to know, sitting in on meetings where violence was discussed with the casual efficiency of a business strategy session. She saw men come and go with injuries that spoke of battles being fought somewhere in the city, heard reports of operations that resulted in outcomes she preferred not to imagine. But she also saw another side of Dominic, the leader who inspired loyalty through fairness rather than fear, the strategist who sought solutions that minimized bloodshed whenever possible, the man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders and bore it with a grace that she had never fully appreciated. The war ended in the way that these things always ended, with a final confrontation that left the Chicago organization broken and retreating, their ambitions for New York permanently extinguished. Dominic came home that night with blood on his shirt and exhaustion in his eyes, and Marie held him without asking questions, understanding that there were some things she would never need to know. When he asked her to marry him 3 days later, with a ring that had belonged to his mother and a proposal that was surprisingly humble for a man of his stature, Marie said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small and private, held in a garden in Connecticut with only their closest people in attendance. Carlos was there, having finally been told the truth about his sister's relationship, his initial shock giving way to a protective wariness that Dominic respected and even seemed to appreciate. Victor served as best man, his severe face softening into something almost like a smile as he watched his boss exchange vows with the cleaning lady who had saved his life. Marie wore a simple white dress that she had chosen herself, refusing the designers that Dominic had offered to fly in from Milan. She wanted to be herself on this day, the woman from the Bronx who had worked her way through life with nothing but determination and grace. And Dominic, for all his power and wealth, seemed to understand and appreciate that choice, looking at her with the same intensity that he had shown when he first opened his eyes on that office floor. The years that followed were not always easy. Dominic's world did not become less dangerous simply because he had found love, and there were moments when Marie questioned whether she had made the right choice, whether a life in the shadows was truly what she wanted. But each time those doubts arose, she looked at the man beside her and remembered why she had chosen him, not for his power or his money, but for the person he became when no one else was watching, the vulnerable soul that he revealed only to her. She continued to run the legitimate businesses, expanding them into a portfolio that rivaled some of the city's most established corporations. The laundromats became a chain, the properties became a real estate empire. The small cleaning lady who had once been invisible now sat in boardrooms and made decisions that affected thousands of employees, always treating them with the same kindness and respect that she had wished someone would show her when she was the one mopping floors. Carlos graduated from medical school and became a surgeon, eventually taking a position at a hospital in Manhattan where he specialized in cardiac care. The irony was not lost on Marie that her brother now saved hearts for a living, just as she had once saved one with nothing but her breath and her hands. When she told him the full story of how she had met Dominic, that night on the 37th floor with the CPR and the kiss of life, Carlos had shaken his head in amazement and said that only his sister could stumble into saving a mob boss and somehow end up falling in love with him. Dominic himself changed over the years, though the changes were subtle and visible only to those who knew him well. He delegated more, trusted more, spent less time in the shadows and more time in the light. He never became a legitimate businessman, not entirely, but the balance shifted, the empire evolving from something built primarily on fear to something built increasingly on genuine enterprise. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Isabella, after Dominic's mother, Marie saw him cry for the first time. He held the baby with hands that had done terrible things, hands that bore the scars of a violent life, and he promised her in a whisper that she would never know the world he had come from, that she would grow up in light and safety and love. It was the same voice he had used when his eyes first opened on that office floor, rough and broken, but now filled with something entirely different. Not desperation, but devotion. It was a promise he kept. Isabella grew up in a brownstone in the village, attended the best schools, traveled the world with her parents, and never learned the full truth about her father's empire until she was old enough to understand and choose her own path. By then, the organization had transformed into something that was more legitimate than not, a family business in the truest sense of the word. 3 years after Isabella, they had a son, Marco, named after Marie's father, and the family that Marie had once dreamed of became real in ways she had never imagined. Marie often thought about that night in the Blackwood Tower, about the random sequence of events that had led her to be in that office at that exact moment. If she had been assigned to a different floor, if she had finished her work 10 minutes earlier, if she had followed her first instinct and minded her own business. 1,000 tiny choices that could have led to 1,000 different outcomes, and somehow, impossibly, miraculously, they had all aligned to bring her here, to this life she had built with a man she had saved without knowing who he was or what he would become to her. She had kissed a dying man to save his life, and in doing so she had found her own. The cleaning lady and the Mafia boss. It sounded like the beginning of a joke, or perhaps the plot of a movie that no one would believe. But it was her life, her story, her impossible reality that proved that fate sometimes had a sense of humor, and that love could find its way into even the darkest corners of the world. When people asked her how she had ended up where she was, Marie always smiled and gave the same answer. She said that she had been in the right place at the right time, and that she had made a choice that changed everything. She never mentioned the fear she had felt, or the doubt, or the moments when she had almost walked away. She only mentioned the choice, because that was what mattered in the end. We are all faced with moments when we can turn away or step forward, when we can protect ourselves or reach out to help another, when we can remain invisible or allow ourselves to be seen. Marie had chosen to step forward, to reach out, to be seen, and that choice had led her to a life she had never dared to imagine. Some might say she was lucky, others might say she was brave. Marie herself would say that she was simply human, doing what humans do when they see another person in need, responding to that ancient instinct that tells us we are all connected, all responsible for each other, all capable of changing the world with a single act of compassion. She had breathed life into a dying man, and in return, he had given her a life worth living. And if that wasn't a miracle, then Marie didn't know what was. If this story reminded you that sometimes the most ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, and that a single moment of courage can change everything, then leave a small sign of your presence, a heart alike a gentle gesture to say that these words found their way to you. Because every story deserves to be heard, and every act of kindness deserves to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, your own moment is waiting somewhere around the corner.